Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan, something slow like distant wind through leaves, or a crackling fire that's mostly smoke. Let's settle into the gloom. There's no rush, the hour's late, and tonight we're starting with bread. But not the kind you're imagining, not soft golden slices from some farmhouse fantasy. No, this is medieval bread, street bread, traveller's bread, bread that's seen things, bread that might still be seeing things. Picture a damp, grey alley in 14th century London, the kind where the buildings lean in on each other like old drunk men, muttering secrets about chimney tacks and dead rats. The cobblestones are uneven, glossed with the memory of yesterday's rain, and something else, something stickier. And from a crooked little table beside a barrel fire you smell it, warm, heavy, slightly burnt, bread, or, well, something bread adjacent. Let's start with trenchers. Now, trenchers weren't so much food as cutlery, a thick slab of stale bread used as a plate for whatever stew, gruel, or pottage someone could slap onto it. Ideally a few days old, hard as a plank, and barely edible unless you had the teeth of a mule. You didn't so much eat the trencher as absorb guilt through it. It soaked up fat and meat juice like a sponge that had already cleaned the stable. After the meal, the trencher might be given to a beggar, or tossed to the dogs, or, if you were feeling festive, eaten cold with a side of dysentery. Now imagine buying that off the street, wrapped in nothing but the breath of the man who made it. For those seeking something more portable, there were the rolls. You'll notice I'm not calling them bread rolls because frankly it's a stretch. They were dense, usually uneven in shape, more weapon than food. Ingredients, flour if you were lucky. Otherwise, ground acorns, mashed peas, barley that still had questions about its identity. Bakers, especially in the poorer boroughs, were known to sweep the shop floor for leftover grain dust, scraps of chaff, and whatever else looked vaguely food-coloured. Into the dough it went. Nothing was wasted, including your faith in humanity. The crust was thick, protective really, like a shell designed to withstand long walks, battlefield snacks, or just being forgotten in a satchel for 3 weeks. Break one open, and it crumbled like sawdust in your hands. Dry, chalky. Smelled faintly of old beer and chimney smoke. Tasted like defiance. Now, let's go even weirder. Enter ash bread. Bread made, quite literally, with ash from the hearth mixed into the flour. Not poetic ash, not some artisanal drizzle of charcoal powder, just ash. Because flour was expensive and ash was, well, there. This gave the bread a curious grey colour, a bit like a graveyard fog. The flavour, earthy, bitter, like regret you could chew. And yes, sometimes it still had bits of unburnt wood in it. A texture that gently exfoliated the roof of your mouth. Still, people ate it. You would too, if the alternative was not eating. And honestly, it paired surprisingly well with the cheap ale of the time, which tasted like malted rainwater and poor decisions. Speaking of ale, that brings us to beer bread, a luxury item made by incorporating dregs from ale brewing, the leftover yeast sludge, into the dough, gave it a tangy, slightly fermented kick. This was the fun bread, if we can call anything fun in this timeline. If you got it fresh, it was warm, yeasty, a little funky. If you got it old, it was still yeasty, but now sentient. Back on that street corner, let's linger. You can hear the distant clink of armour, the murmur of prayers from the chapel across the lane, the wheeze of someone selling boiled onions. And that one guy hawking his trenchers, stacked high, still steaming from a fire fueled by questionable wood and even more questionable labour laws. A buyer, gaunt, wrapped in wool that's more patch than fabric, picks one up. He turns it over in his hand like he's inspecting a tool, takes a bite, chews, chews some more, stops. Not because it's delicious, but because it might be fighting back. Still, it's warm. And in the medieval world, warmth meant something. You didn't ask for flavour. You asked for calories, bulk, presence. Bread was presence. Heavy in your hand, heavier in your gut. Meant you might just last through another frostbitten evening. Now here's a fun, or not so fun, fact. Medieval bakers were notoriously shady. Because flour was precious and temptation was cheap, it was common practice to add things like ground chalk, powdered bone, or, and I'm not making this up, clay. Anything to stretch the dough a little farther. The government eventually stepped in with regulations, demanding that bakers mark their loaves with a baker's mark, essentially medieval branding, so if you bit into a loaf and found a pebble, you'd know who to blame. In some cases, the punishment for short-weight bread was to be baked in your own oven. No, seriously, that's one way to reduce workplace misconduct. So yes, bread was street food, the first, the most basic, the one that outlived empires. It was sustenance more than indulgence, hard-edged, murky, shaped by poverty and the weather and the fact that nobody really knew where their next meal was coming from. It was warm if you were lucky, edible if you weren't picky, and sometimes just barely bread. But in that cracked loaf, that ash-streaked, ached roll, there was something, a stubbornness, a kind of edible protest against the dark. And in the medieval night, when the streets smelled of smoke and sweat and dung, and your hands were cold, and the rain had been falling for days, that lump of bread, it mattered, even if it did taste like church basement and boiled dust. Hey again. Still here with me? Good. The night's gotten a little colder. You can feel it in your fingertips, or maybe that's just the ghost of some forgotten draft sneaking in through a cracked window. Let's keep sinking. Further into the alleys, deeper into the soot. Tonight, it's hot meat, cold hands, and the peculiar comfort of something wrapped in pastry and filled with secrets. Before you even see it, you'll smell it. A kind of oily warmth drifting on the fog. Meat, yes, maybe beef, maybe something vaguely bird-shaped, laced with onion, garlic, and something burnt at the edges. Not burnt like toast, but burnt like memory. It clings to the air in that way old grease does, thick, persistent, a little sad, and still, somehow, deeply inviting, like the feeling of a blanket you're not sure was ever washed, but it's warm and you need it. You follow the smell, you always do, and there it is. On a table warped from rain and time, beside a stack of sooty napkins made of yesterday's linen scraps, a pie, a hand pie to be precise, roughly the size of a clenched fist, with a golden brown crust that looks like it's seen battle. The crimping around the edges is uneven, done in haste. The top is scorched just slightly in the centre, as if a coal fell on it, and no one had the heart to scrape it off. It's warm, just barely. Held between your cold fingers, you can feel the heat seeping out of it, not radiating exactly, more like escaping. You take a bite, slowly. The crust flakes, but not willingly. It fights back. It's tough at the corners, soft in the middle, soaked with whatever has been stewing inside. The filling is meat, probably. Let's not pretend this was prime-cut anything. Meat pies in medieval streets were the ultimate don't ask, just chew experience. A mix of whatever could be spared. Offal, scraps, liver, kidney, tongue, sometimes rabbit, sometimes pig. Eon, sometimes something less enthusiastic. If it had bones and once made a noise, it had potential. To this medley they added breadcrumbs for bulk, maybe some minced onion, a flicker of spice if the vendor had ambitions. Cinnamon and cloves were popular, not because they masked the taste, but because they distracted the nose. It wasn't uncommon to bite into something chewy, not gristle exactly, but an unexpected texture. You'd pause, contemplate your life, and then keep eating, because there were no refunds, and your fingers were already too greasy to gesture politely. You might imagine the pie seller as jolly. He's not. He's tired, thin, wrapped in wool and leather that hasn't been dry in weeks. His cart is a soot-blacked box with an iron tray on top, hot with coals. The pies rest there like sleeping animals, warm and oily and waiting for their turn. He rotates them slowly, sometimes poking them with a stick, sometimes muttering at them. Occasionally, one hisses. You try not to think about why. He doesn't call out to passers-by. Doesn't need to. The smell does the work. His hands are red from cold, and so is his nose. But he handles the pies with reverence. Each one is money. Each one is a small gamble that tonight you won't get caught selling bad meat, because yes, that happened. You see, meat pies were a trickster's game. You could fill a pie with anything, and many did. Dog was whispered, rat occasionally confirmed, cat. The noble class would clutch their pearls. The working class would nod solemnly and take another bite. Pie shops, especially the ones with too many pies and not enough customers, were notorious. A bishop once wrote that God alone knows what is under that crust, and even God, presumably, wanted no part in it. There were laws, of course, inspectors, but they were underpaid and overfed, a coin in the right hand, and suddenly the pies were pork again, or close enough. It wasn't about deception, really. It was about necessity. Meat was meat, and the pie was warm, and warmth, in winter, forgave a multitude of sins. Eating a medieval meat pie wasn't casual. It was an act. First the crust, flaky but thick, protective, an edible sarcophagus, sometimes underbaked, sometimes scorched. The bottom always a little soggy, because gravity has no morals. Then the filling, steaming, savoury, almost overwhelming in its richness, fat clinging to your tongue, bits of meat mixed with something soft. Bread, maybe brain. You didn't ask, you just chewed. And it filled you. Not just your stomach, but your chest, your hands, your lungs. The heat crawled into you slowly until the cold of the night felt distant. For a moment. Then the chill crept back in. Pies were cheap. That was the point. Pennies. Maybe half a penny if it was end-of-day stock. People lined up in cloaks and rags, shaking from the damp, handing over their coins with fingers too stiff to count. And every now and then someone would walk away holding 2 pies, not one. A kindness from the vendor, or a bribe, or maybe he just needed to get rid of the batch before the smell turned. Food was business and survival. If you could walk away full, or even just warm, it was a win. Flavors were a bonus. Health, negotiable. You finished the pie slowly, or maybe not. Maybe you devoured it, as most did, eyes on the fog, back to the wind. The grease lingers on your lips. The taste, sharp, savoury, faintly metallic, clings to your teeth. You wipe your hands on your cloak. It doesn't help. You walk on. Somewhere behind you, the pie man packs up. The coals hiss as he douses them. The last pie, uneaten, is tossed to a dog, or a rat, or maybe kept for morning. Who knows? The night closes in again, meat-scented and oddly peaceful, and you're warm. Kind of. For now, hey, welcome back. You're still awake, or maybe you're just somewhere between sleep and not. That's fine. That's where we want to be. We're going back to the market, but this time we're headed toward the glisten, toward the salt, toward the fish. In medieval Europe, you couldn't eat meat every day, not because of taste, but because of God. There were fasting days, lots of them, where meat was forbidden, but fish was allowed, and nothing says devotion quite like chewing a small, glistening herring off a wooden stick in the middle of a muddy street. Some people did it for religion. Others did it because that's what was cheap and plentiful and vaguely edible. Eels were common. Dried fish skins were sold like snacks. And if you were lucky, or unlucky depending on your outlook. You might even stumble upon a bit of squid, curled and hardened like a piece of chewed boot leather. But the staple, the standby, was always the same. Something caught, then cooked, then speared. Let's get closer. To the corner of the square where a small brazier crackles. You smell it before you see it. A mix of smoke, seawater and oil that's done far too much work in too little time. The vendor is half lit by the glow of the coals. One eye squints against the heat. His apron, if you can call it that, is stained with fish guts and resignation. He hums tunelessly as he flips something shiny and slightly charred. There, skewered on blackened sticks, are your options. Eel, twisting, blistered, lacquered in oil. Small, dried fish, flattened like pressed flowers. Something indistinct but definitely aquatic. Each one glistens in the firelight, not in a beautiful way. More in the way old leather shines after a rainstorm. But they're warm, and they smell complicated. You hand over a coin, too much probably. He nods once, hands you your regret on a stick, and turns back to the flames. Eel was everywhere. Not glamorous, not rare, just available. Rivers were full of them. The Thames used to writhe with the things long before it started belching up factory runoff and whispered curses. They were oily, boneless in a slippery, muscular way, fried quickly, often whole, sometimes split lengthwise and curled into a spiral that looked almost festive, if your idea of a party involved teeth and vague dread. Eating eel is a sensory event. The skin is slightly rubbery. The inside is soft but dense. There's a slickness that stays with you, not just on the tongue, but in your memory. It's hot at first, then quickly not. And cold eel, on a stick, is a test of character. Some skewers offered a bit of texture. Dried fish leather, thin strips salted and hung until they curled, were popular among those who enjoyed snacks that fought back. You'd chew, and eventually the strip would surrender, sort of. There was no burst of flavour, just salt, and a vague, briny tang that might have been seaweed, or decay, hard to say. You'd eat it slowly, mostly to fill time, or to look busy. It gave your mouth something to do while your thoughts wandered elsewhere, maybe to land animals, maybe to bread. Fish snacks were common among the poor, but even the wealthier classes had their own shameful versions. Salt cod soaked in vinegar, potted fish paste, fish tarts. Yes, those were a thing, because if you can bake it, you can fill it with regret. Let's stay a while. The fire flickers low. A few other late-night wanderers drift in and out, exchanging coins for sticks, nodding in tired silence. One woman bites into a smoked mackerel and doesn't flinch. She's done this before. You hear music somewhere, a reed pipe, off-key, a drum that might be a barrel. Someone is singing a song about drowning, cheerfully. There's laughter, but it's quiet. Everything is muted by fog and fatigue. You look down at your skewer. It's mostly bones now, the meat pulled off in small, hesitant bites. There's a crunch in your teeth. You pause. You don't want to know what it was, and so you don't. You toss the stick into the ash pile. It sizzles briefly, then is forgotten. Of course, this wasn't just food, it was virtue. Fasting was about restraint, and nothing made you feel holier than pretending your meal was suffering in edible form. Fish was penitence. It reminded you of the sea, of sacrifice, of doing your best with what you had, even if what you had was something that once stared at you from a barrel with dead, milky eyes. People convinced themselves this was noble. Some even came to like it. That was the scariest part. They'd lick the oil from their fingers, pick bones from their teeth with pride. They were surviving. And that meant something. The stall closes. The coals dim. The vendor wraps his apron around the remnants and limps into the fog. He smells like salt, smoke, and exhaustion. You're left with the aftertaste. It's not terrible, just persistent. Your fingers feel slick even though you wiped them twice. The air smells faintly of burned scales. You walk slowly. The night is darker now, somehow, quieter, and behind your teeth, somewhere far in the back, a tiny flake of fish remains. You'll find it in an hour, maybe 2, when you're trying to sleep, and you'll remember this moment. Warm eel, cold hands, and all the small mistakes we make when we're just trying to stay full. Hey, still with me? Good. Let's take another quiet step into the dim corners of food history. This time, we're headed somewhere softer, supposedly sweeter. Though I wouldn't get too excited. Tonight, we're going to talk about dessert, if you can call it that. Dim the lights, maybe lean back, let your hands fall into your lap, because this is less of a treat and more of a meditation on what happens when people crave joy, but don't quite know what it tastes like yet. We begin in a stone kitchen, somewhere deep and cool. The air smells like boiled fruit and dust. There's a faint hum of bees outside, and on the table in front of you, a bowl, sticky, brown, glistening. Let's begin. You might think dessert is eternal, that sweet things have always closed the meal, kissed the edge of the tongue, finished the story. They haven't. In medieval Europe, sugar was expensive, imported, rare, sometimes treated more like medicine than food. For most people, sweetness came from whatever was willing to rot nicely. Honey, dried fruit, syrups, maybe a squashed apple if it got warm enough in your satchel. So dessert didn't mean light or airy or fun. It meant dense, sticky, slightly confused about what it wanted to be. Let's look closer. Figs were everywhere, not because they were beloved, but because they were available and incredibly patient. You could boil them, dry them, mash them, stuff them with things. They didn't complain, not even once. The result was something like fig paste, a heavy, glistening mound of brown fruit that could be rolled into balls, layered into crusts, or simply slapped onto bread and called a delicacy. The texture, imagine jam left out too long, slightly tacky, grainy with seeds. It didn't spread so much as cling. It arrived on the tongue with the enthusiasm of a wet wool sock, but it was sweet. Technically, people added herbs, nuts, even little bits of peel. They served peel to wake it up. It rarely worked, but at least it looked like effort. In the homes of the wealthy, those with access to real sugar, confections got a bit more experimental. Fennel seeds, rose petals, even chunks of ginger were dunked in syrup and left to dry. The result was a kind of medieval candy, sweet, sure, but also medicinal, like chewing perfume out of a pharmacy drawer. Candied fennel in particular was offered after meals to freshen the breath, which is a polite way of saying you'd just eaten something foul, and everyone knew it. They tasted like black licorice, soaked in honey, then wrapped in chalk, but they sparkled, and in low torchlight sparkle counted for a lot. Honey and nuts were a more straightforward affair. Take whatever nuts you could afford, walnuts, hazelnuts, maybe almonds if you were showing off. Roast them until slightly bitter, then drown them in honey until they agreed to stick together. Mold into clumps, let cool, done. No one called it brittle, that would require crunch. This was more bendy, a kind of medieval energy bar, if your only energy source was slow despair. Still it satisfied. It stayed in your bag for days, and it tasted like effort. If your dessert couldn't be good, it could at least be wet. Fruits were stewed, boiled, poached, sometimes in wine, sometimes in vinegar, sometimes in syrup made from reduced grape must. They weren't trying to highlight the flavor, they were trying to hide it. Pears were particularly guilty. They showed up in everything, sliced and simmered, soft enough to dent with your tongue, then spooned into a bowl with a bit of sticky liquid that looked like cough medicine and tasted almost pleasant. Apples came in next, plums, anything that wouldn't disintegrate outright, and even if it did, well, you could call it a mash, or a pottage, or a compote. They had so many words for "we tried." It wasn't dessert as climax, it was dessert as a gentle murmur. "I'm sorry," it whispered. "That was a lot of meat. Here's a plum to make up for it." Medieval confections had identity issues. They didn't want to be entirely sweet. That felt indulgent, dangerous. So they were spiced, heavily. You'd taste cinnamon, clove, maybe saffron if someone was feeling dramatic. Everything was warm, complicated, and just slightly bitter, like a compliment with conditions. These weren't desserts you'd crave. They were desserts you respected. You'd eat a few bites, nod solemnly, then set the plate aside like you'd just learned something about yourself. The room is still. You're holding a small wooden spoon. It sticks to your fingers. The fig paste on the table has begun to sweat slightly, a glisten beneath the surface like it knows it's being watched. You take a bite. It clings to your teeth. There's a sweetness there, but it's slow, faint. It comes in waves, first fruit, then bitterness, then a dull ache of spice. You chew and chew. The sound is soft, like someone folding paper underwater. Outside, the bees have gone quiet. Inside, the honey remains, still, heavy, waiting. So, was it good? It depends on your mood, on your definition of pleasure, on how recently you had access to actual sugar. But it was real. It was made with care, or desperation, or both. And it filled a space. Not the space in your stomach, the space between courses, the space between silence and sleep, the soft end of a day made mostly of salt and shadows. Sweet, technically. But like most things from that world, it carried weight. Even joy had a crust. It begins with a smell, sharp, earthy, a little damp, like someone left a barn door open too long and the air decided to settle in your nostrils for the night. You're walking through a quiet medieval market just past dusk. The crowds have thinned, the fish are gone, the bread is stale, but near the edge, beneath a cloth awning that might once have been blue, sits a wooden stall. It's not clean, nothing is, but it is honest, and it smells intense. You're here for cheese, or something that resembles it. Settle in. We'll take this slowly. Before refrigeration, there was improvisation and a certain cultural tolerance for risk. Cheese was, essentially, what you got when milk had nowhere else to go, when it had to transform, fast, before the rot outpaced the reward. Most cheeses in medieval Europe were raw, unpasteurized, alive in every sense of the word. They changed texture with the seasons, softened in the summer, hardened in the cold, occasionally bulged unexpectedly. There were no labels, no expiration dates, just instinct and luck. Some were dry and hard enough to use as weapons. Others oozed slowly into their containers, sighing slightly as they warmed. Like most things in the Middle Ages, your cheese told people who you were. The poor lived on the young ones, fresh, crumbly, curd-heavy, made quickly, spoiled even faster. They had little flavour beyond salt and a faint taste of linen from the cloths they were drained in. The rich, they could afford age. Their cheeses were stored in cellars, turned, watched, allowed to mature until they developed something resembling a personality. Monasteries made some of the best. Monks were the original cheese influencers, tending wheels with solemnity, patience, and an impressive tolerance for barnyard aromas. They even washed them in beer or wine if the recipe called for it, or if someone dropped a bottle. The results were pungent, meaty, and slightly ecclesiastical. Biting into medieval cheese was never a neutral experience. You might encounter resistance, a hardened rind that needed to be negotiated with the side of a blade or the edge of your teeth. Or it might yield immediately, like it had given up, warm, gooey, threatening to slide off the knife entirely. Some crumbled like damp chalk, others had a spring to them, squeaking faintly as they bounced across the tongue. And then there was the rind, not the neat waxed kind you find in modern supermarkets, but natural, coarse, and often visibly alive. Covered in mould that had been described, charitably, as edible, it was, mostly. Cheese at a market stall was rarely cold. Refrigeration was a rumour. Instead, it sat out all day, absorbing the sun, the dust, the faint breath of livestock and humanity passing by. By evening, the soft cheeses would begin to warm, not deliberately, not delicately, but with a quiet internal heat, as if fermenting emotions. They'd sag slightly on the board, develop shine, start to weep, and still people bought them, tore off hunks of bread, scooped the middle out with fingers or knives, ate them with satisfaction and visible uncertainty. Warm cheese, eaten standing up, it's a choice. But in that moment, surrounded by straw and steam and the low sounds of the market closing, it feels almost right. Let's talk flavour, slowly, carefully. That first bite? Sour, not sharp, sour. A deep inner tang that hits the back of the tongue like a memory of spoiled cream that somehow got better instead of worse. Then, salt, always salt. Preservative, flavour enhancer, necessary evil. Underneath, if you're lucky, a buttery richness, a note of pasture, a faint whiff of whatever animal produced the milk, usually cow, sometimes sheep, occasionally goat, if you were somewhere more adventurous or unlucky. And if you kept chewing, because once you start you kind of have to, the finish arrives. Deep, fungal, a little nutty, a little sweaty, like old socks that have been respectfully aged. It should be noted, gastrointestinal roulette was part of the deal. Raw cheeses could harbour surprises, and not the charming kind. Salmonella, Listeria, brucellosis, long before they were names on warning labels, they were simply facts of life, things that happened, things you hoped wouldn't. But also, your stomach was probably tougher than it is now, hardened by years of marginal water, borderline meat, and deeply suspect pastries. So you took the risk. Because cheese, real cheese, warm and fragrant and slightly dangerous, was a reminder that food could be more than fuel. It could be indulgent, slightly sinful, mysterious, like licking a cathedral floor and liking it. The lingering smell of comfort and concern. The air around you is rich with dairy and doubt. You've eaten your share. A few bites off a crust, a smear with a hint of rind, the kind of flavour that lingers even after water. There's still some left, sweating softly under the moonlight. A little bulge has formed, possibly new. A small fly lands on it. You don't stop it. The fly knows what it's doing. Nearby, someone else is chewing slowly, looking into the distance like they've just had a religious vision, or a flash of now. See. Sometimes it's hard to tell. You walk away eventually, you have to, but the cheese stays behind, on the stall, in the air, in your mouth, faintly, like a shadow you swallowed. And later, much later, when the world is quiet and your stomach makes a sound you weren't expecting, you'll think of that cheese. You'll wonder what it was called. You'll wonder if it was worth it. And then you'll wonder if there's more. Cheese, in its truest form, is a contradiction. Solid and liquid, fresh and ancient, comforting and mildly threatening. In medieval times it was nourishment, indulgence, and sometimes penance. but it was never boring. And if you're quiet now, if you sit very still, you might still smell it, faintly, underneath everything else. A whisper of dairy, a hint of risk, the soft, curdled voice of the past. Speaking, slowly, through cheese. The fire is low. Ash flickers in the wind. You're walking through a town that's almost entirely closed, except for one stall, haphazard boards nailed into stubborn persistence, lit by a dying oil lamp and the orange-blue sigh of cooking fat. Someone's frying something. And the air smells familiar. Not pleasant, but honest. A little like old flour, a little like smoke, and unmistakably like onion, burnt at the edges. It's not hunger you feel, not exactly. It's curiosity, and a mild, lingering ache for carbs. The medieval pancake, such as it was, didn't have a name that would comfort you. Sometimes it was called a fritter, sometimes a panade, occasionally just something to eat if you still had teeth. But the principle remained. Take flour, add water, maybe milk if it hadn't turned. Add whatever else you had, onions, herbs, egg if you were bold or blessed. Then flatten and drop into oil that had seen better days. It was rarely sweet and never golden. More often it came out the colour of bruised wood, brown with blackened edges, slightly warped in shape, like someone had stepped on it by accident and decided to serve it anyway. Flour wasn't a guarantee, and it wasn't white. What you had was coarse, stone ground, full of personality, by which we mean pebbles. Occasionally, it still smelled faintly of the sack it was stored in, or the animal that dragged it home. Wheat, if you were lucky. Rye or barley, if you were not. Oats sometimes, although oats didn't fry well. They sort of flopped. Sieving existed, but not always, so any pancake was also a bit of a gamble for your dental work, such as it was in an era without toothbrushes or insurance. Still, people ate them, because people are people, and there's something about warm fried bread that overrides common sense. Medieval frying oil was ambitious, often reused, rarely strained. Animal fat was most common, pork lard or beef drippings, if you had access to animals that died of causes other than famine. Olive oil, in theory, existed, but not for this. It was for churches and nobles and people who didn't need to be here at this hour watching their dinner wrinkle in hot fat. The oil hissed when the batter hit. Sometimes it spat, sometimes it simply sighed, resigned to its role in the cycle. The cakes puffed slightly, then settled, not fluffy, not crisp, just present. If there was an onion in the batter, and there often was, you'd know. The smell alone was unmistakable, sharp, sweet, a little damp. Onions gave the pancake a purpose, a little heft, a little bitterness. Some were raw when they went in, others had been scorched in advance, softened over coals until they caramelized just enough to hint at sweetness, then tossed in to deepen the batter's mood. You could taste them long after the rest faded. They lingered like smoke in your clothes, or a bad idea in the back of your throat. There was no timer, no thermometer, just instinct. When one side started to darken, you flipped it, or you didn't. Some cooks flipped them once. Some kept turning, nervously, hoping to find a perfect side that never came. You could tell who was confident by how little they touched the pan. Eventually, the pancake came off, curled slightly at the edges, glistening in a way that suggested both satisfaction and stomach discomfort. It was served, if we can use that word, in a rough scrap of cloth, or a piece of bark, or just the hand. No garnish, no ceremony, just hot, oily bread, vaguely seasoned and heavy with fate. The first bite was always too hot. Steam escaped through your teeth. The crust offered minimal resistance. Then came the chew, dense, soft in the middle, with pockets of grease that hadn't fully drained. The onion hit you next. A bit raw, a bit sweet, slippery almost. And then something crunchy, maybe a herb stem, maybe a tiny rock, no one asks. Salt if the cook was generous. Pepper if someone nearby had travelled recently and wasn't paying attention. Mostly, though, it was the texture you remembered. That particular medieval mouthfeel, damp, gritty, and mildly reassuring, like being fed by someone who's never been hugged. These pancakes were poor people's food, portable, filling, almost resistant to spoilage, because they already tasted slightly off. They were sold on street corners, eaten during lean times, Lent, rainy days, or days when you simply didn't want to think too hard. They cost very little, and gave just enough in return to keep you upright. And in a world where meals were inconsistent and life was short-ish, a warm fritter with a whisper of onion might feel, briefly, like care. As you walk away from the stall, the scent follows you. It clings to your sleeve, settles in your hair. The oil seeps into your fingertips, and no amount of wiping on your tunic will fully remove it. It's not bad, not exactly, just stubborn, like most things from that era. You pass others holding their own portions, steaming, sagging in the hand. No one looks delighted, but no one complains. The pancake is what it is. Predictable, heavy, fried into compliance. Pancakes, in the medieval sense, weren't fluffy, golden miracles. They didn't come with syrup or fruit or even hope, but they held the line between hunger and survival. They were edible architecture, structural, unsentimental, and built to endure a few more hours of life. So if you find yourself standing in tow, cold, with a little flour and less optimism, consider the fritter. The apocalypse is always closer than it seems, and you might as well meet it with something hot, flat, and mildly onion-scented in your hand. The cobblestones are damp. Again, the air hangs heavy with wood smoke and yeast, like someone's been baking bread in a brewery and spilled most of it. You're near a tavern, probably, but the door's half closed, and someone's snoring just inside it. So instead, you drift toward the side alley, where the real culinary decisions happen, quietly, illegally, sometimes under a cloth. A wooden cart, no wheels, just legs. Limp by the side of a barrel fire, staffed by a woman with one eye and a deeply unbothered expression. She's not here to charm you. She's here to feed you, or at least distract your gut until you pass out. Let's begin. Fermentation in this context is less science and more accident refined over generations. A jar of turnips, the brine opaque, floating bits suggestive. The lid doesn't sit flush. It wheezes a little when nudged, but no one nudges it. The vegetables inside are no longer crisp, and probably no longer vegetables in the traditional sense. They've gone soft, translucent, tangy. You could call them preserved, but that would imply control. What they are is sour, and possibly medicinal, possibly not. Somewhere on the edge of coagulation and comfort lies beer cheese. It's not a dip, it's a warning, a thick off-white mass, soft but resistant, smells faintly of ale and more strongly of someone's cellar. Spreadable, in the same way wet clay is spreadable. It comes on a hunk of bread that once had structure. The crust is hard, the middle is dense. The cheese glues itself to it with a grim, mealy determination. You bite. It's sharp, salty, slightly fizzy if it's been sitting out too long, and it has. Your eyes water a bit. That's normal. Batter, like most things, can be improved with alcohol. At least, that was the theory. Ale-battered snacks were common in certain corners, especially near inns, stables, or places where judgment was already competent. Romist, a strip of onion, a leaf of sage, a sliver of turnip if you were feeling adventurous. They were dunked in batter made with beer, Flat, sour beer, usually, rescued from the bottom of the keg, then dropped into hot fat until they puffed slightly and browned in odd patterns. They came out greasy, often undercooked in the middle, but warm and vaguely herbal, and if you'd already been drinking, oddly perfect. Pickling in the medieval era was not an exact art. It was survival, flavoured with vinegar and denial. Carts carried jars. Some were filled with garlic cloves, steeped in brine so strong it made your eyes sting from 2 feet away. Others held eggs, small, brown, hard-boiled long ago, and now bobbing sadly in cloudy water. The texture predictably rubbery. Then came the wild cards. Mushrooms, beans, bits of fish, possibly fruit, no one asked. If it fit in a jar and didn't immediately rot, someone had tried to sell it pickled. You'd eat them at your own risk. But also your own pleasure, the salty tang cutting through the fog of too much ale and too many thoughts. There was always one dish that cleared the air. Fermented fish, sometimes herring, sometimes anchovy, sometimes a nameless species that simply floated into town. It came from a sealed crock. The lid had to be pried open, and when it was, people nearby instinctively took a step back. The smell, bold, intimate, something between the underside of a dock and a goat's final breath. But if you were raised on it, or too far gone to object, it could be sublime, sharp, deep, complex, layered like a punishment that teaches you something, spread on dark bread, topped with onion, maybe a dollop of mustard, if you were on a good streak. And afterward, you'd need to sit down. Not from fullness, but from awareness. Drinking snacks weren't meant to be balanced. They were meant to hold the world at bay. Salty enough to bring tears, sour enough to jolt your brainstem, soft enough that you didn't have to chew too hard because that took effort. Pickled roots, cheese that had opinions, ale-soaked barley cakes, dense, flat, mildly fizzy, and still warm from fermentation. They weren't snacks in the modern sense. They didn't sparkle, they brooded, but they soaked up the alcohol and gave your hands something to do while your thoughts slowed down. Of course, what would snacks be without the drinks? Warm ale, cloudy, unfiltered, served in chipped mugs. It tasted of grain, of damp wood, and something metallic that no one talked about. Sometimes spiced wine, reheated over coals until it tasted mostly of cloves and lost time. And mead, sweet, heavy, slow, like syrup that had somewhere to be. Each sip took a little more off your edges, and each bite of sharp, salty food brought you back, just far enough to ask for another round. You're not alone out here. Others have gathered. Bent figures, red noses, greasy fingers. All standing in the torchlight, chewing thoughtfully, slowly. There's no talking, just the occasional grunt or the clink of crockery. This is not a celebration. This is communion with brine and mould and the slow rot that keeps you alive. Fermented snacks aren't here to charm you. They are blunt, complicated, sometimes sentient, but they endure, because people have always needed something to chew while waiting for the world to settle. And the best way to meet despair is with a sharp, pickled turnip in your mouth and nothing left to lose. So here's to sour things, to the cheese that fizzes, to the egg that probably shouldn't still be edible, and to the mug of ale you forgot you ordered. Drink slowly, eat whatever that is, and let the night do what it does. The street is emptying. Stalls are closing, shutters groaning shut, wood creaking like it's lived through something. You can still smell smoke, not fire, just the patient kind that comes from old coals and indecision. There's no music, just the shuffle of boots and the soft, regular clatter of something dry being tossed into a paper cone. A slow rain has started, thin and indecisive. It taps on metal and cloth and old skin. Somewhere near the edge of the square, under a sagging canopy, there's a man with bad teeth and a basket full of stories disguised as snacks. You approach. because that's what you do. Nuts and seeds weren't bought to be admired. They weren't plated. They didn't come with sauces or descriptions or anything resembling charm. They were stored in cloth pouches, woolen pockets, sometimes just a fold of linen tied in a knot. You'd reach in during a lull, between chores, before mass, after drinking but before sleeping, and pull out something dry, sharp, and vaguely edible. These were not snacks of joy. They were distractions, crunchy lies mostly, a way to keep your jaw busy so you didn't say what you really thought. They look warm, that's the trick. Roasted chestnuts were the illusion of comfort, split open with a thumb and grimed fingernail. Steam escaping like a promise no one intends to keep. The shell flakes off in dusty crescents, revealing a soft interior, pale, slightly sweet, faintly reminiscent of a good memory you're not entirely sure you had. But eat too many, and they turn to paste. They cling to your tongue like regret. They sit in your stomach like stones, building a small, edible cathedral of discomfort. Still, they were hot, and that was enough. On a wet night, that passed for grace. Pumpkin seeds, fennel, poppy, sunflower, when they could be stolen from someone's garden before the birds did their work, often tossed with salt. So, me times with ash. If someone felt ambitious, there might be a whisper of coriander or dried thyme, flavor profiles that wandered into town but never settled. The seeds were sold in cones, scraps of paper, sometimes old letters, unreadable by the time they were greased with finger oil and street dust. You'd chew them slowly, cracking the shells with your molars, spitting the husks discreetly into your palm or your sleeve. The taste, sharp, dry. The kind of spice that doesn't warm you, just reminds you you're still awake. Almonds were exotic, imported, expensive. The sort of nut that implied you had something to prove, or that someone else had died for your good mood. They came roasted, sometimes sweetened, honey glazed and brittle as glass, or rolled in spice if someone nearby had travelled far enough to learn how to burn things just right. They snapped in your mouth with a little too much enthusiasm, and always, always left one sharp edge that found its way between your teeth and waited until you smiled. Luxury, in other words, but painful. Hazelnuts were local, ubiquitous, which is another way of saying no one really wanted them, but no one could escape them. Hard shells, stained with soil and time. They cracked under stone, or between two other nuts, or in the quiet theatre of your own teeth. The flavour was fine, earthy, mild, forgettable. The kind of taste that only became nostalgic in exile. But they stored well, they travelled well, and you could eat them in silence while pretending to be busy. Sometimes that was their only charm. Some enterprising soul always went too far, took seeds, sugar, nuts, honey, and heat, and invented something that broke both molars and morale. Nut brittle, seed bars, snacks with ambition and no sense of proportion. They were sold as treats, but they were punishments disguised in sweetness, hard as slate, sharp as gossip. You'd bite once and remember every mistake you ever made. They shattered in your mouth. Bits got lodged in gums, but they kept your hands sticky and your tongue too busy for complaints. It's possible that was the point. There was a rhythm to it. Reach into the pouch, feel around for something not too small. Bite, chew, pause. It wasn't about hunger, it was about repetition. About doing something that didn't require decision, or heat, or permission. You could share them. Pass a handful across a bench, drop a few into a child's pocket, toss some at a bird and watch it think twice. They were currency, comfort, camouflage. And they lasted. Through storms, through war, through winters where bread was a dream and meat was a story, you told yourself to fall asleep. Imagine sitting by a fireless hearth, wool wrapped around your feet, cold settling deep into your sleeves. You have a handful of seeds. They crack between your teeth, dry and sharp. The salt stings your lip where it's cracked. You're not sure if it's blood or seasoning, but the taste is family's. Either way. Outside, the wind makes old wood complain. Inside, your jaw moves slowly. No thoughts, no warmth, just sound and the slight ache of survival. No one wrote poems about them. Nuts, seeds, the crumbs at the bottom of cloth bags. They didn't earn feasts or blessings or feudal taxes, but they were always there, in the folds of cloaks, in bowls near hearths, on the counters of people too poor to waste flour and too smart to starve. You don't honor them, you eat them, and forget. And tomorrow you reach into your coat again and find a few more. Dusty, familiar, ready to crack. The air is thick, not quite rain, not quite smoke, just that old medieval humidity where nothing dries and every smell hangs around longer than it should. A fire crackles low in a metal brazier. Above it a pot, blackened on the outside, bubbling quietly on the inside, leans slightly, like it's tired of holding secrets. There are no signs, no menus, just the unmistakable scent of something wet and edible, barely contained by steam. You join the queue because no one in line has died yet, at least not visibly. Street stew was never about individuality. You didn't ask what was in it. You didn't customize. You didn't send it back. It was what it was, whatever that was. The cauldron was communal, not in the romantic shared experience sense, more in the everyone's germs are already in this sense. Chunks floated in broth. Unidentifiable, yet somehow familiar. Was that a root, a tendon, a potato? Doesn't matter. It's warm and mostly liquid. Sometimes it tasted like meat, other times like sadness boiled with turnips. You ate it anyway. It was the closest thing to comfort you could buy with a coin and a prayer. If you were lucky, or if the vendor had flour that week, your stew came in a bowl made of bread, stale bread, hollowed out and hardened. The kind of loaf that could double as a blunt weapon or emergency roofing material. But it absorbed the broth, softened as you ate. By the time you finished, the crust had gone from iron to sponge, soaked through with flavor and doubt. There was no waste, no dish to return, just crumbs on your chin and a slightly greasier outlook on life. It was an efficient transaction. Warmth in, dread out. Not everyone got a bowl. Sometimes you just held out your hands. The stew was ladled into a scrap of cloth, or a chunk of bark, or a crude cup carved from horn, or your hands themselves, if you were brave, or broken enough. It burned, of course. The steam rose from your palms, but the cold had done its work, and pain was a distant echo. The vendor didn't make eye contact, just dipped, scooped, poured, like a priest at a very heretical mass. You slurped quietly, tried not to chew, and wondered why carrots always floated, but hope never did. Spoons weren't always provided. When they were wood, splintered, gnawed at the handle, passed from hand to hand, rinsed in a bucket that no one had looked too closely into for at least a week. Some used flat stones, others had bone-handled scoops. One man brought his own, carved from a deer antler and probably cursed, or you used your fingers. Let the broth cool just enough to drip into your mouth, scooped the rest with bread. Wiped the grease on your sleeve, which already told a long, greasy story of its own. Every now and then, you'd bite into something with texture, fibrous, chewy, a little too warm, could be pork, could be rat, could be turnip pretending to be both. The vendor would smile vaguely if asked, then quickly change the subject. Some stories are better left uneaten. Bones sometimes made an appearance, small like a bird, or large like, well, not a bird. The flavour was rich, too rich, the kind that lingered in the back of the throat and hinted at the fact that some animals scream when boiled. You didn't ask for details, you just drank more broth. On meatless days, and there were many, stew went green. Not fresh green, not healthy green, more of a mossy, lichen-adjacent palate. Leaves boiled down to mush, beans half-cooked, lentils in denial, roots sliced into lumpy medallions, herbs, maybe, weeds, definitely. The broth took on a flavour best described as garden runoff, but hot, always hot, and hot was enough. You chewed because that's what was expected. You swallowed because what else were you going to do? There was no privacy. You stood or sat near others, bent over your bowl or cloth or questionable bark plate. You didn't talk much. Everyone was concentrating on the heat, on the texture, on avoiding the bone sliver currently threatening their molar. You judged others silently. That one slurped too loud, this one left too much, in the crust. That child licked the ladle. You wondered if it was always this bleak. And then the stew hit just right, warm, salty, vaguely umami. And you stopped wondering. For a few minutes you were full. Not happy, not safe, not clean, but full. The fire burned low. The last bits of stew were thick, sludge-like. The bottom of the pot had seen things. Vendors scraped it out with wooden paddles, served it to the latecomers. The dregs, heavy with overcooked onions and the kind of meat that used to blink. Those who got the bottom spoonful often looked grateful or dazed. Hard to tell in the dark. You wiped your chin, sniffed your sleeve, wondered how long stew breath lingered, and moved on, past the flickering stalls, into the fog. Your stomach gurgled, your soul sighed, and somewhere a new pot was beginning to boil. It's quiet. Even the roosters have decided to wait. A thin fog hugs the ground, swirling around clumps of mud and leftover humanity, the kind of silence that hums in your ears. And then, somewhere in the distance, a wet coughing fit, and the familiar, hopeful scrape of a wooden spoon against the bottom of a pot. This is where we begin. Pottage wasn't a food, it was a concept, a lifestyle, an edible sigh. A medieval morning rarely began with clarity. It started instead with pottage, a slow-cooked, flavour-optional slurry made from whatever was left over from the night before, and if nothing was left, water and grain, boiled together until they agreed to behave. It simmered in a pot that never really got cleaned, just added to, layer upon mysterious layer, yesterday's porridge becoming today's soup, becoming tomorrow's regret. There was no al dente, no crisp edges. Everything was soft, collapsed, surrendered. The consistency hovered somewhere between oatmeal and surrender, warm, damp, and a little too honest. It slumped off the spoon, sat heavy in the bowl, tasted like a memory you weren't ready to deal with. You didn't chew pottage. You endured it. There's a particular smell to early morning gruel, boiled barley, a hint of leeks if the garden hadn't been raided by goats. On the good days, a whisper of pork fat or cheese rind that had survived the night. But mostly it smelled grey, like warmth without joy, like damp cloth near a hearth. Steam curled into your face as you leaned in. Your eyes watered slightly. You told yourself it was just the onions. Sometimes the pottage was medicinal, not intentionally, but a thick, salty mash of root vegetables and barley had a way of anchoring the soul. especially after a long night of ale, bad decisions, and falling asleep in a ditch behind the alewife's stall. You'd wake with a skull full of regret and a mouth lard, a burlap sack. What you needed wasn't a cure, just ballast, something to fill the void and keep your hands from shaking, and that was pottage. It didn't heal, but it didn't judge either. Gruel was what happened when you ran out of even the illusion of ingredients, just grain, boiled to the edge of despair, occasionally salted if you had a kind neighbour or had recently robbed a monk. It arrived in a bowl that still held the ghost of yesterday's stew, and it slid down the throat with all the enthusiasm of wet cloth, but it was warm. And sometimes warm was enough. Gruel didn't nourish the body so much as distract it. A small comfort, a hot nothing. And in the medieval morning, that counted as mercy. It's worth remembering. This wasn't comfort food in the modern sense. There was no butter, no sugar, no gently sautéed aromatics. There was just starch, heat, and the gentle resignation of another day ahead. Still, people found their comforts. A pinch of herbs, a scrap of last week's bacon, a single egg cracked into the pot, stirring quickly before anyone noticed you had one. These were small luxuries, microscopic victories in a world that rarely offered seconds. You ate with a spoon, wooden, rough, possibly communal. If you were lucky, it hadn't been used as a fire poker the night before. Bowls were simple, clay, chipped, warm from the pot. Some ate directly from the cooking vessel if they lived alone or had accepted their fate entirely. There were no napkins, just sleeves. Always sleeves. You wiped your chin, your nose, your shame. The cloth remembered everything. You sat by the fire or near the coals if the wood had run out. The world outside was still, too early for sermons, too late for sins. No one talked. They just ate. Each mouthful a slow concession to the demands of the day. You could hear the breath of livestock outside. A pig rooting through scraps. A dog licking something it shouldn't. The gentle clink of a pot lid settling into place. Steam curled from your bowl. The grey mash glistened faintly, like a pudding that had lost its wowlers. Ill to live. You took another bite. Eventually, the bowl emptied. You scraped the last bit with your spoon, catching a glob of something more solid. Was it pea, turnip, grit? You didn't ask. You stood, stretched, felt the weight of your meal settling into your spine like a sleepy stone. The fire crackled one last time. The pot was topped off with water, ready to begin again. Because pottage never truly ended. It just continued. A rolling boil of survival, and so did you. In a world of harsh mornings and harder evenings, pottage was the grey thread stitching it all together. It asked for nothing, promised even less. But it stayed. And in the cold, soot-stained quiet of medieval mornings, that was enough.